Chosen ones. Somewhere between the breath you just took and the thought you are about to think next, a quiet door is opening for you. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of certainty that cannot be reversed. Because this moment was not created by chance. It was scheduled long before you ever questioned your worth, long before confusion made you doubt your direction, long before fatigue tried to convince you that waiting was all your life would ever be. And now that door opens because the season of preparation has ended and the season of revelation has begun. Even if your eyes have not yet caught up with what your soul already knows, for this message does not arrive to entertain you. It arrives to realign you, to remind you that you were never forgotten, never delayed, never misplaced, only hidden until the precise alignment of time, strength, humility, and readiness met at one point. And that point is now. Understand this clearly. What is moving toward you does not require your permission. It only requires your awareness, because destiny does not knock twice. It enters when resistance dissolves, and today resistance dissolves quietly within you. Not because you forced it, but because you are finally tired of carrying identities that were never yours, expectations that were planted by fear, and timelines that were built by comparison. And as these false structures fall, something truer rises. Something older than your struggle, something written into you before language, before memory, before even hope. And that is why this message feels familiar, even though you have never heard it spoken this way before. Because it is not new information, it is ancient confirmation. Confirmation that the delay was protection, that the silence was training, that the isolation was refinement, and that what felt like absence was actually alignment happening behind the scenes, piece by piece, layer by layer, breath by breath, until you could carry what is now approaching without breaking under its weight. Because what is coming is not small, it is not fragile, and it is not temporary. It is a restructuring of your life from the inside out. A shift that begins internally, but refuses to remain hidden externally. And this is why old patterns are losing their grip, old desires are losing their appeal, and old fears are losing their authority over you. Not because you suddenly became stronger, but because you finally stopped arguing with your own becoming. You stopped negotiating with doubt, and you stopped asking permission to grow beyond the version of yourself that survived but never truly lived. And now life responds accordingly. Opportunities begin to reorganize themselves around your courage. People begin to either rise with you or fall away without explanation. And circumstances that once blocked you begin to move as if guided by an unseen intelligence, which they are, because nothing about this phase is accidental, not the timing, not the discomfort, not even the moments where you feel unsure. Uncertainty does not mean misalignment, it means expansion. It means you are stepping into territory where your old maps no longer apply. And new navigation must be built through trust rather than control, which is why this message does not ask you to rush. It asks you to remain present, because presence is the bridge between preparation and fulfillment. And when you stand fully present, you notice signs that were always there but previously overlooked. Subtle confirmations woven into ordinary moments, unexpected clarity in quiet hours, strength appearing exactly when you thought you had none left. And through these signs, you begin to realize that you were never waiting for life to change. Life was waiting for you to believe differently, to see differently, to choose differently. And that choice has already been made within you. Even if your mind has not yet fully articulated it, because the soul always moves first and the mind follows when it is ready, which is why this message reaches you now and not earlier, not later now. Because now you can receive it without distorting it through fear or urgency. Now you can allow it to settle, to root, to expand, to rewire how you see yourself and what you expect from the future and from this moment forward. The narrative shifts subtly but permanently. You stop asking why things took so long and start understanding what the time was used for. You stop trying to prove yourself and start allowing yourself. You stop chasing validation and start embodying truth, and as this internal alignment locks into place, external confirmation becomes inevitable. Not because you demanded it, but because you finally matched it, and when alignment happens. Manifestation is not forced. It is automatic. It unfolds naturally, often quietly at first, but with unstoppable momentum once it begins, and you are standing at that threshold now, whether you feel ready or not, because readiness is not a feeling. It is a state of alignment, and alignment has already occurred, which is why this message does not end with a promise. It ends with recognition. recognition that you are already in motion, already chosen, already supported, already guided, and already becoming the version of yourself that once felt impossible to reach. And this is only the beginning, not because something external is about to start, but because something internal has finally said yes. Because the shift was already happening long before you noticed the tension changing inside your chest, long before your thoughts began rearranging themselves without effort, long before old explanations stopped satisfying you. And that is exactly how true transformation begins. Not with noise or announcement, but with a subtle internal rearrangement that refuses to be ignored. A quiet recalibration where what once felt necessary suddenly feels heavy. Where what once felt impossible begins to feel inevitable. And you may not yet have language for it, but your awareness recognizes it instantly, because something within you has crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. And this crossing was not impulsive. It was earned through endurance, through unanswered questions, through nights where clarity refused to arrive, yet you kept moving anyway. And now the movement has slowed. Not because progress has stopped, but because alignment has taken over. Alignment does not rush. It positions, it places, it prepares the environment internally so the external world can respond without resistance. And that is why this phase feels different from everything before it. There is less urgency and more certainty, less striving and more knowing, even when outcomes are still unfolding, and that knowing is not arrogance. It is remembrance. Remembrance of a deeper truth that existed before doubt learned how to speak, before fear learned how to negotiate, before limitation learned how to disguise itself as logic. And as this remembrance activates, you begin to see your past differently, not as wasted time or misdirection, but as calibration. Each experience fine-tuning your perception, strengthening your discernment, sharpening your resilience so that what arrives now can be held without distortion. Because the next chapter of your life is not built on survival. It is built on stability, integrity, and intentional expansion. And this requires a version of you that can stand without apology and move without hesitation. A version that no longer confuses patience with stagnation or humility with self-erasure. And this version is emerging now, not through force, but through release. Release of roles you were never meant to play long-term. Release of narratives that required you to shrink to be accepted. Release of timelines that belong to other people's expectations. And as these releases occur, space opens. Space that must be filled. And what fills it is not chaos, but clarity. Clarity about what matters, who matters, and what no longer deserves your energy. And this clarity becomes the foundation for decisions that feel cleaner, simpler, and more aligned, even when they are difficult. Because difficulty no longer signals danger, it signals growth. And growth is no longer something you chase, it is something you allow. And allowing is powerful because it trusts the intelligence of the process rather than trying to control every outcome, which is why opportunities now approach differently. They don't demand you betray yourself to access them. They meet you where you are rather than asking you to become someone else. And this is how you know you are aligned, when doors open without you abandoning your values, when progress does not require self-neglect, when success no longer feels like a trade-off between achievement and authenticity. And as this alignment stabilizes, your inner dialogue changes. It becomes less interrogative and more directive, less reactive and more intentional. You stop asking if you are ready and start asking how you will steward what arrives. You stop asking if you deserve it and start considering how you will expand responsibly within it, because readiness at this level is not about confidence. It is about capacity. And capacity has been built quietly through every moment you thought you were being overlooked, every delay that forced you to deepen rather than rush, every pause that required you to listen instead of perform. And now that depth becomes your advantage, not something you have to explain or defend. It speaks for itself in how you move, how you choose, how you respond, and how you no longer feel compelled to prove your progress to anyone who is not aligned with your direction. And this shift also changes your relationship with time. Urgency dissolves because trust has replaced it. Patience becomes active rather than passive. It becomes a strategic stillness where you observe before you act, discern before you commit, and align before you advance. While everything around you appears ordinary on the surface, something extraordinary is reorganizing itself beneath your awareness, not as a sudden miracle, but as a deliberate recalibration of cause and effect, where past intentions finally meet present readiness. And this convergence feels subtle only because you have grown accustomed to intensity being loud, when in truth, the most powerful shifts happen quietly, with precision rather than spectacle. And this precision is now guiding you into a phase where discernment becomes more valuable than desire, where alignment outweighs ambition, and where inner coherence replaces external urgency. Because the life unfolding ahead of you is not asking you to run faster, it is asking you to stand truer, to choose cleaner, and to move with an integrity that cannot be negotiated away by convenience or fear. And this is why certain distractions are losing their pull, not because they were wrong, but because they have completed their purpose. And completion does not always come with closure or explanation. Sometimes it simply comes with disinterest, a neutral fading that makes space without drama. And into that space enters clarity, not as a rigid plan, but as a flexible direction, a felt sense of rightness that guides decisions even when outcomes remain undefined. And you may notice that you are no longer seeking constant reassurance, no longer scanning the environment for signs that you are allowed to proceed, because permission has shifted from external validation to internal authority. And this authority is calm, not defensive, confident without being performative, steady without being stagnant. And from this internal steadiness emerges a new relationship with uncertainty, one where unknowns are not threats, but invitations. Invitations to engage creatively rather than reactively, to respond thoughtfully rather than impulsively. And this changes how challenges appear. They no longer feel like interruptions to your path. They feel like refinements of it. Adjustments that sharpen your direction rather than derail it. And as this perspective stabilizes, you begin to notice how much energy was previously spent resisting what was already happening, trying to force clarity before readiness, trying to accelerate outcomes before capacity was built. And now that resistance softens, energy returns, not as frantic motivation, but as sustainable momentum, the kind that supports long-term creation rather than short-lived bursts. And this momentum aligns naturally with opportunities that are proportional to your growth, not inflated beyond it. Because excess without integration creates collapse, and you are no longer here to repeat cycles of expansion followed by burnout. You are here to build something that can be held, maintained, and evolved over time. And this intention subtly influences the kinds of connections entering your life now. Fewer but more resonant, quieter but more reliable. Relationships that do not require you to fragment yourself to maintain harmony. And through these interactions, you experience a new standard of mutual respect, where boundaries are assumed rather than negotiated, and where depth is valued over constant availability. And this standard extends inward as well, changing how you speak to yourself, how you rest, how you recover, how you pace your efforts, because self-respect is no longer a concept. It is a practice repeated daily through small, consistent choices that compound over time. And as these choices accumulate, they create an internal environment that supports clarity under pressure, adaptability under change, and resilience under uncertainty. And from this environment, creativity flows more freely, not as inspiration dependent on mood, but as a disciplined expression of alignment. And this is why ideas now arrive differently. They feel less urgent to prove and more compelling to refine, less about recognition and more about contribution, because contribution grounded in truth outlasts attention driven by noise, and you are moving into a phase where longevity matters, where what you build is intended to endure beyond immediate feedback, beyond trends, beyond external approval cycles. And this requires patience, but not passive patience. Active patience that continues to show up, continues to adjust, continues to engage, even when results are still consolidating beneath the surface. And this engagement is guided by intuition sharpened through experience. Intuition that has learned the difference between fear-based hesitation and wisdom-based timing. And this discernment becomes one of your greatest assets, allowing you to say no without guilt and yes without self-betrayal. And as these decisions accumulate, your life begins to reflect coherence, a sense that different areas are no longer competing for dominance but cooperating toward a shared direction. And this coherence creates ease, not because challenges disappear, but because you are no longer internally divided while facing them, and unity within creates strength without. And this strength is quiet but unmistakable. It does not demand acknowledgement. It commands respect through consistency, and over time, This consistency reshapes your identity from someone who is becoming into someone who is being present, being intentional, being aligned. And from this state, progress is not something you chase. It is something that unfolds as a natural consequence of who you are choosing to be each day. And this unfolding will continue to reveal itself gradually, not all at once, because revelation that arrives too quickly cannot be integrated. And you are here to integrate, to embody, to live what you have learned rather than rush toward the next lesson. And this integration anchors you deeply enough that external fluctuations no longer destabilize your sense of direction. You may adjust your approach, but you do not abandon your core. And this steadfastness allows you to navigate transitions with grace rather than resistance. Understanding that change is not something to survive, but something to steward. And stewardship requires awareness, responsibility, and humility, qualities that have been cultivated within you through every experience that asked you to slow down, reflect, and realign. And now those qualities are no longer being developed. They are being utilized, applied in real time as you shape the next phase of your life with intention rather than reaction. And this intentionality transforms ordinary actions into meaningful progress because meaning is not found in scale. It is found in alignment. And alignment turns even the smallest steps into powerful movements forward. And as you continue, you will notice that doubt still appears occasionally, but it no longer dictates your direction. It becomes background noise rather than a controlling voice because trust has taken its place. Trust built not on blind faith, but on lived evidence of your capacity to adapt, recover, and evolve. And this trust allows you to remain open without being unguarded, hopeful without being naive, and committed without being rigid. And these balanced states create a foundation strong enough to support expansion without collapse. And this is the kind of growth you are stepping into now. Not dramatic, not rushed, but deliberate, integrated, and sustainable, unfolding moment by moment as you continue to choose alignment over appearance, truth over comfort, and depth over distraction. And this choice, repeated consistently, is what quietly transforms trajectories, not just circumstances. And you are already in motion within that transformation, whether you pause to name it or not. As the inner narrative continues reshaping itself without asking for conscious approval, you may sense a growing distance between who you were conditioned to be and who you are now actively choosing to become. And this distance is not emptiness. It is expansion, a widening field of awareness where reactions slow down and responses gain intention, where impulses are observed rather than obeyed, and where identity stops being something you defend and becomes something you inhabit. And inhabiting your truth requires presence rather than performance, which is why this phase feels quieter yet heavier with meaning, because silence is no longer absence. It is integration in motion, and integration is demanding. It asks you to sit with nuance instead of rushing toward conclusions, to tolerate ambiguity without forcing certainty, and to allow understanding to mature organically rather than prematurely. And this maturity shows itself in subtle ways, in how you listen more than you speak, how you pause before committing, how you feel less compelled to explain yourself to people who are not equipped to understand your direction. And this is not withdrawal, it is refinement. Refinement of attention, energy, and intention, because scattered focus can no longer support the level of coherence you are cultivating, and coherence requires discernment. An ongoing choice to invest in what aligns rather than what merely distracts. And as discernment sharpens, priorities reorder themselves naturally. Not through discipline alone, but through resonance. What resonates stays, what doesn't quietly exits. And this exit is often misunderstood as loss. But in truth, it is liberation from misalignment. Liberation from obligations that diluted your presence. From commitments that demanded compromise at the cost of integrity, and from roles that required you to stay smaller than your capacity. And as these structures dissolve, a new architecture of self emerges, one built on clarity rather than compliance, intention rather than inertia, and responsibility rather than reaction. And responsibility here does not mean burden, it means ownership. Ownership of your choices, your direction, and your pace. And owning your pace is particularly important now because accelerate.